Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the hot topic that is generative AI. When we sat down as a technology group within our firm to discuss tackling this as a subject, we thought it didn't quite seem right for you to only hear from lawyers. So I'm delighted to say that we've joined forces once again with our good friends at WaveX Technology, and they'll be able to bring their own technical expertise, experience, and insights to the discussion. You'll be hearing from three of us today. Starting with me, my name's Oliver Kidd. I'm a partner in the IP, IT and commercial team here at Pennington's Manches Cooper, and I'm joined by Tom Perkins, one of the associates in our team. Tom and I both play an active role in our firm's technology and digital business group, and Tom in particular has an interest in all things AI. And providing the technology expertise, I'm delighted to be joined by Gavin Russell. Gavin is the CEO of WaveX Technology, a leading IT company based in London, and he's been helping his clients navigate many of the topics which we'll be covering today. So looking at the topics for today, here's the agenda. We're going to begin with a discussion around the basics of generative AI before moving on to the operational benefits and organization readiness. And the next bit is the real interesting part, which is around the practical application, where Gavin will show you how these tools can be used in your business. We'll then be covering legal considerations before then considering next steps. And hopefully we'll leave some time at the end for a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll see if we can pick some of those up at the end. And as it's election day here in the UK, of course, we thought we couldn't pass up the opportunity of running our own quick poll. So this is really just to gauge, to get a sense for how much generative AI features in your day-to-day work and business operations. So it's on a scale of 1 to 5, and the question is, to what extent does generative AI feature in your day-to-day work or business operations? And the scale is 1, not at all, or perhaps that's probably not yet, all the way through to number 5, which is generative AI is a critical part of your business operations, and it's backed up with all of the work that we're going to be talking about today in terms of having a list of approved AI applications and policies, procedures, security controls, and all of that good stuff to ensure that it's being used in the correct manner and all of the risks are mitigated. So hopefully you've all managed to respond to the poll. Interesting, yeah. So hopefully you can all see that. And it seems, yeah, as expected, the majority is around the 2 and 3 mark. Yeah, and personally, I put myself down as a 2. Gavin's obviously been showing me the great benefits of Copilot, and perhaps I should have used that to produce our slides. But yeah, I think that's an interesting insight from everybody here, and we'll bear that in mind as we carry on. And I suppose the reason we qualified not at all with not yet is this is very much a growing industry. And for those that aren't seeing much generative AI in their day-to-day work, we do think that's likely to change in the near future. And certainly the stats in this area back that up.
Thank you, Ollie. I mean, it's almost, there's not a week that goes by that there's not some talk about AI in the news. So just to highlight a couple of points, obviously from a financial point of view, the AI market in the UK is currently worth around 16 billion, but it's forecast to grow to 800 billion by 2035. So that really gives you an idea of the scale of AI. There's a massive explosion of AI companies. It's increased by 688%. So a lot of businesses are getting into the AI world. there's lots of examples. I won't go through everything here. Lots of examples of the benefit AI is having for organizations. So there's little doubt that AI is a rapidly growing area. But what exactly is AI? And more specifically, what is generative AI?
Thanks, Gavin. So just to kind of underlie the talk, I thought we'd start with the basics of generative AI. So this is a type of artificial intelligence that learns from input data and training data to create new and original content. So this can be text or music, and it's all based on the patterns that the AI has learned from the training data. So these tools are based on foundation models, and the most commonly used one for Gen AI is the large language models, or LLMs. And these are models that have been trained on vast amounts of text data so that it can then generate outputs that are in the form of human-like text. So this is good for things like translation, answering questions, or general text or content creation. And by doing this, it's trained to predict what the next token, which is either a letter or a word, is in a sequence of tokens, and it learns through a process called back propagation, which is by making mistakes and then having it corrected. So this is how its statistical patterns are used to predict and form output. So if the model was given the phrase "the sky is," it might eventually learn that the next word would be blue. So the key thing is that it's actually just predicting what the next the token will be based on the patterns it's learned. It doesn't actually understand the text in the same way that a human would. It's just predicting that next token. So that's how they're trained. And once they're trained, they're ready for use. And that starts with an input from a user. So this can be, as I say, text or an image or anything that's particularly relevant to your task. So something I found quite interesting was OpenAI, to demo their new version of ChatGPT, actually sketched on a napkin an outline of a basic website and took a photo of that and uploaded it to ChatGPT and asked it to generate the code for that website, which it then did to a pretty remarkable standard. So once that input's gone in, the model processes it based on, as I say, what it's learned in its training, and assesses the patterns and structures to then generate a response, and it will predict the next word in the sentence, and then it generates the output. So this would be one word at a time, or with images, might be one pixel at a time. This is then put together in the final output following post-processing and formatting to get it into a format that we'd recognize and be able to digest. And that's the final output from a Gen AI tool. So of course, there are many benefits which are, all across the news and we're all quite aware of, but just to focus our minds on a few of these. Automation in areas like marketing or education is really important, because Gen AI can be used to quickly draft ad copy, website articles, social media posts. It's also had application, as I say, in education, where learning materials can be generated quite quickly. I actually use Gen AI when I'm drafting articles or other content, but to get the ball rolling on a topic that I'm already quite familiar with, it gives a starting point, and then I can tailor that to my needs and the tone of the post or article that I'm drafting. It can also be applied across a variety of industries where there's a customer or consumer facing element, and we've probably all seen this with the automated chatbots. So these are really useful if a customer has a quite simple initial query, and this can be solved quite quickly by a Gen AI tool, and that obviously frees up human resource to deal with more complex and challenging queries. In manufacturing, it's also had applications where it can be used to optimize processes or generating more efficient production layouts and workflows, and it can generate 3D models that would otherwise be quite time-consuming or complex to create. One really valuable use of Gen AI has been in the healthcare and life sciences sector, because as I've said, it can churn through huge amounts of data very, very quickly, and this is really valuable in research and drug discovery because it's much quicker than traditional methods. Something I've seen that's quite interesting recently is what's called synthetic data sets. So to produce a large data set for research purposes would be very time consuming and very costly. So Gen AI can take a much smaller data set, which is much more cost effective to produce, and create synthetic data, which will enlarge and enrich that data set and make it much more useful in a research application. That can also be useful if you've got data privacy issues to overcome as well, because obviously the synthetic data can't be assigned or attributed to a real individual. So there's obviously many ways that Gen AI can be applied in businesses, and Gavin will touch on some of these now.
So there's two main use cases in how sort of generative AI is being used. So you've got it's being consumed as business for business processes. So many of the AI vendors, you've probably heard of OpenAI, but obviously Microsoft have versions of their generative AI designed to be consumed by business processes or custom applications. So that's it for use in things like CRM, security applications, compliance applications, as Tom just mentioned, medical applications as well. So wherever you've got data in a business, having AI automatically assess that. The other, and arguably slightly easier step into AI is to empower workers. So ultimately enhance the worker's experience. Most companies have a lot of unstructured data. So AI is great at going through that and empowering the worker to be more productive ultimately. So having a look at a specific type of AI, I don't know if you guys have heard of Copilot. So Copilot, Microsoft's partnered with OpenAI, and Copilot is sort of Microsoft's flavor of AI, which Microsoft has heavily integrated into their entire application stack. So all the common Microsoft apps like Word, PowerPoint, Outlook, SharePoint have AI now embedded in it using Copilot, which again is OpenAI's version. Now, there's a number of benefits using something like Copilot. First of all, many organizations that are Microsoft centric already have the right tool set. So it's literally sort of turning it on and obviously paying Microsoft a license fee. But with that, you can improve efficiencies. So you can help improve staff's efficiency by reducing labor intensive activities, things like drafting emails, creating presentations, summarizing meetings even. AI can do all of those very easily. Improve productivity. So Copilot can help businesses improve their productivity by analyzing data for you. It's especially helpful where you've got vast array of data and you want it to go through that. Cost savings, by definition, if staff become more productive, you can save a significant amount of money. And content creation. We all create a lot of content, marketing content, sales content. AI can help. And although it's possibly not quite at the stage where it will just create it and you can run with what it creates, which we'll sort of talk about some of the risks of that in a bit, it can still really help you get going. Many staff struggle with the blank sheet of paper. Where do I actually start? So AI can give you a really good initial start to that. So let's look a little bit about how might you talk to something like Copilot. So ultimately, it's all about the prompt. So the prompt is, what are you going to ask and how do you structure your question to get the most value out of AI? So there's a couple of components to that. So first of all, you need to build your prompt. And it generally starts with something that defines the output. So first of all, defining the time or length. And that might be, I need a single page. I need something that's going to create a 30-minute presentation. Then you go on to say, what format do you need it in? obviously, if you look at the Microsoft ecosystem, it could be a document, it could be a slide, it could be an image, it could be an email. So at the bottom, you can see we're sort of building up this prompt. And I'm going to try and do a live demo in a second, which is always a bit nerve-wracking because this stuff's quite new and it's not always 100% reliable. So you might say add a slide. Now, I've chosen something that's quite complicated. Anyone that knows about finance will probably have heard about EBITDA. Those that haven't, hopefully this will explain it. So we're saying add a slide about EBITDA, but it could be about absolutely any topic you can think about. You know, the best zoos to visit in the UK, you know, the best amusement parks, I mean, any topic. And that's partly the power of AI. What's your audience? Now, this is important because AI can actually fine-tune the output to be more suitable for a particular audience. So we've taken something that is quite complicated within the whole finance sphere. So if we're presenting to a bunch of finance directors, we can probably go with a pretty complicated definition of it. But if we're presenting to a non-technical audience, we want to tell the AI that we want the output to be for a non-technical audience. And then finally, you can actually add more definition about who you are presenting this. So if we take all of this together, okay, drum roll now, I'm just going to move over to my screen for a second. Okay, this is where all goes horribly wrong. I'm used to Teams. Oh, I think you need to stop sharing first, Tom. Sorry.
Yeah.
Great. And I'm just going to show you the presentation in its normal sort of presentation view. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, good.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, PowerPoint, hopefully that's familiar to many of you. What you see with Copilot in particular, you get a new icon called Copilot, and that appears in the whole Office suite. So we can click on it and it gives us a few ideas of the sort of questions we might want to ask it. But if I type in the prompt that we've just designed, and then I click on Go, off it goes, understanding the prompt, and hopefully just keeps me on my toes. It then will spit out something. There we go. It's just popped it at the top of the deck. So this is the slides. Now, as you can appreciate, you know, that's a pretty good first stab, and it's done that in about 5 seconds. You know, now, if any one of us had to create that slide, we'd probably do a bit of Googling, you know, try to work out what picture would go with it. We're looking at maybe, you know, 10 minutes. That's just a very simple example of what it can do. In addition to that, if you had a Word document, you can actually tell it, read the Word document and create a presentation from that. So very quick demonstration of the sort of the power of AI, especially generative AI when it comes to content creation. I'll just stop sharing, Tom, if you want to reshare the next slide. Now, there's lots of other uses of AI, and we've just put a couple of examples here because tools are great, but they're only as good as people remembering that these tools can add value. You know, so sometimes when something's new, we need a bit of creativity. You know, we need to be thinking about what actions might we perform in a typical day, and actually, if we've got these tools available, how can we best use them? So we put some examples here. So here are some prompts for different sort of scenarios managers might encounter on a day-to-day basis. So you've got, you know, conflict resolution. You could ask an AI to provide various strategies to help mitigate that. Performance reviews, you know, what are good factors to consider when evaluating teams' performances? You know, meeting effectiveness. You know, how can I make team meetings more engaging? Now, AI is great because it will effectively look at a huge repository of data and provide you some really useful ideas. Now, as I said before, you don't necessarily want to run with every idea it gives you, you know, that they are still subject to things like hallucinations. But for giving you ideas of things that you can use within your organization, they're extremely, extremely powerful. And there are many other organizational benefits where AI can help.
Yeah. So in August, sorry, I think I was sorry. Bear with me on my- Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Gavin. The applications are obviously broad, and there are obviously loads of benefits to this, but it's important that you consider the risks associated with it and analyze these tools effectively before implementing them. So it's important that businesses have a real accurate and up-to-date understanding of all the tools that are used by the staff in their organization. So a simple way of doing this could be by issuing a survey to across the organization, whereby they identify the tools that they're using. And that might be a real broad range of tools, but it's important that if they are using them, you or your IT team or compliance investigate each of these and comprehensively assess them on a number of bases. So this could be whether the output could infringe a third party's IP rights. It could also be an assessment of the accuracy of the output, so how valuable these are going to be in the use that they're being trialed. You'd also want to assess whether there's gaps in training data or whether there's the potential to introduce bias into the outputs, and also whether the inputs that are used by your users or your staff are used to train the model, or whether it's closed off, because you don't want to be putting information that's sensitive to your company into a tool that's then trained and then can be used by potential competitors. So once you've had that review, you'll have a better idea of what these risks and benefits are, and it will help you to perhaps implement what we would consider maybe an approved list or an authorized list of AI tools that are appropriate for use within the organization, and also go along with that how it's to be used, what sort of information can be input, and what can be done with the outputs. But we'll touch more on policies later. So once you've done that initial step, you can't just stop there, because as the capabilities of the existing tools improve and are enhanced, and new tools are introduced, you'll want to update and adapt your policies and your lists. So that needs to be continually monitored. It might also be useful at this stage to document these assessments and the reviews that you've conducted, because whilst it might not be necessary now, it's likely that in the future, organizations that use AI tools will need to demonstrate compliance with legislation, whether that's in the UK or further afield, depending on where you do business or direct business. So, for example, the EU AI Act is quite clear already that it has pretty robust disclosure and compliance requirements. So having these risk assessments to hand will be useful if you need to comply with that regime. It should also be borne in mind that your use of AI may also impact other areas of compliance. So in particular, data protection is a big one. So if you're introducing a tool that changes how you use your customer data or any other personal data, it might be necessary to update things like privacy policies and mandatory impact assessments under the GDPR. So that's part of the approach to introducing AI into your organization. But it might be helpful to include this as part of a broader AI strategy for implementing these tools through a pipeline.
Thanks, Tom. Here's an example of a high-level AI strategy. Now, obviously, there's lots of different ways this could be planned out, but AI is such a game changer for every organization. It's best if it is planned as part of a structured approach. One way of looking at it might be something like this, where across the bottom you've got the level of investment, and the axis, the y-axis is the scope of change. So you can see here, tier one of your AI strategy are the sort of low-hanging fruits. It's the least expensive, and it's probably the easier to implement. And you've got things in there like making sure your Word documents have got AI friendly templates, PowerPoint templates. You can do simple things like transcribing meeting notes, copywriting for websites or social marketing. These are relatively easy things to implement from a sort of generative AI perspective, and shouldn't be too expensive. Now, obviously, as we move to tier two, you're starting to look at business processes. And that's now, instead of just impacting some individuals, is starting to impact business departments. And then you've got things like summarizing documentation, you've got automating some of your business processes. Then you might move into things like assessment checks, where you've got some automated AI making sure content is meeting your guidelines. And then when you've got AI deployed across the business, which is a sort of tier 4, you've got it ultimately making decisions. So obviously, by that point, you've made a sizable investment in AI. And with all of these things, the challenge is with anything like this that can be beneficial to the organization, often there are some negative possible consequences. So you really want to make sure you've considered what those are. So I think it's important to consider what are the legal considerations that you need to bear in mind to protect yourself from some of these negative consequences.
Yeah, so Gavin's absolutely right. And a starting point for this would be your contractual relationship with a supplier. So this would either be through a direct contract with the supplier or terms and conditions. So, of course, there are some slight nuances with AI as opposed to traditional contracts. So we've pulled out a few key ones here, but this would really permeate a full agreement. So delivery and training, explainability, and intellectual property are something I'll discuss now. So in relation to delivery, things like AI training and whether delivery is made to you according to a specification or other sort of statement of requirements is really a crucial concept. So to put this into perspective, an AI tool may be delivered to you pre-trained with the data ready to use for your required objectives. But it could also be provided to you for you to train yourself once delivery's taken place. So then that begs the question, whose training data is going to be used? So I think there are multiple permutations here. It either could be the supplier is training it with its data and then given to you, or the supplier is training it with your data, then it's given to you, or you might be given the tool with the supplier data to train it in the way that you want, or it's delivered kind of bare and ready for training that then you'll train with your data. So getting that right early on and allocating the parties' respective obligations in that regard is really important. Explainability. Now, this concept is that it goes to how the AI tool reaches certain decisions and what weighting is given to certain facets of that decision-making process. So that determines whether the tool itself is explainable or not. And that will become, that's something that regulators are pushing quite heavily, that these tools need to be transparent and explainable. Now, that isn't always possible if you're using an off-the-shelf tool with proprietary AI tech. The supplier is likely to be unwilling to give you the information and explainability that you need, because that's where the value of their business lies. So where that intersects with commercial contracts is when you're perhaps contracting for development of a specific tool. And usually this would be, in a typical sale of goods contract or services, you might agree a specification to which the supplier's performance is measured. The problem with an AI tool that lacks explainability or the supplier is not prepared to give you that is it's very difficult to pin down what that specification might be. And then that makes it very difficult to hold the supplier to account. So in those regards, you may need to leave the concept of a design to a specification behind and focus more on kind of an objectives-based specification, whereby you set out and scope what you want to use this tool for. What are the use cases? What are your objectives? And so the supplier is then obliged to provide a solution that meets that objectives-based criteria. And that would make the performance of that solution more easily measurable, because it would be matched against those performance indicators that you've agreed as part of the negotiations. So that would be a way to pivot if there really isn't that explainability of the tool. And we wouldn't be able to talk about legal considerations without talking about intellectual property when it comes to AI tools. And so setting out the ownership and responsibility for the AI, as well as the data and outputs, is really key to get right at the start to avoid issues down the line. So in a typical contract for the supply of an AI solution, there are a variety of items that could generate questions of IP ownership. So this starts with the party's respective background IP, the solution itself, training data, any ownership of upgrades or improvements to the solution, or any customization for the customer itself, any potential inventions or developments that are created by the AI that run parallel to the objectives that you've set out. So anything kind of auxiliary to that. And then the outputs itself, or the products created by the AI that are really, the objective of the contract. So, I mean, perhaps other than the party's background IP, any of the IP rights that subsist in those items could, in theory, be owned by either party or licensed to another party. So it's really important to consider at the outset who are going to own those pieces of intellectual property, and how they're going to be licensed, and how that structure will work. Another potential pitfall is the scope for copyright infringement, to be, claims to be brought against either developers or users. And this could apply to your business if you're using the outputs in your business processes. So you could consider more AI-specific warranties and indemnities to protect against these claims, but this would need to consider the AI solution throughout its life cycle, because perhaps, as we've seen in some of these quite well-known cases that are ongoing at the moment, some AI tools have been trained on copyright-protected works without license or consent. So a consideration of where that liability will be allocated is really important. And as I touched upon, the outputs and the copyright in those outputs as well, and whether that's likely to infringe on third-party rights. So it's copyright in the outputs itself isn't really settled law right now. So it's useful if the contracts themselves set out ownership of that. So, for example, in the terms and conditions of both ChatGPT and Copilot, they attribute ownership of all outputs to the user. So as a first port of call, if you're using tools with standard terms and conditions, it's worth reviewing these to assess who is going to own the outputs and how you can use these in your business. Another key point, as I've touched on earlier, is data protection and privacy. Some tools require personal data for the training phase of the life cycle. For example, in life sciences, significant amounts of patient data is used to train AI, and the more the better in order to produce reliable outputs. So this requires an analysis that isn't too different from your usual processing analysis, but it does bear thinking about. So use of personal data in training solutions, or even being used as inputs, should come with an assessment of an Article 6 lawful basis for processing and to justify the process. And that should be established and recorded. And where possible, data should be anonymized, where it's not necessary that another person can be identified as part of the output. Again, using the life sciences example because it's quite helpful, health data is considered special category data. So beyond assessing and identifying an Article 6 lawful basis, an Article 6 special category condition for processing, such as explicit consent or justification based on a substantial personal public interest, should be identified and again recorded in accordance with the GDPR.
Thanks, Tom. As Tom just mentioned, there are so many different generative AIs out there. They all have different sort of rules, regulations, contracts. So it's really vital that you understand those key points. I mean, data sovereignty is also an important area. You know, due to GDPR, many of these AIs are US based. So any data that it mines within your organization is ultimately going to be residing on servers in the US. Now, the challenge is staff will probably be using ChatGPT anyway, and that's why it's pulling them into a more formal structure. So you're in control of that. So taking Copilot as a good example, obviously Microsoft has given a lot of thought to how to deal with this from a security and privacy point of view. But there are still some areas that organizations need to be aware of. So Copilot ultimately takes its data from your SharePoint, which will cover things like OneDrive and email. So any data you've got in your SharePoint, it will mine that information. Now it tags the information with the permissions of the users that have access to it. So by definition, each user that enters a prompt to Copilot, the data it returns will only be based on the data that that user has access to. So that sounds like a sensible approach. However, many organizations do not have a well-structured permission structure. And also over the years, what will generally happen is individuals might need access to other files, other folders, which might not necessarily be fully pertinent to their role. New people start in that organization, and sometimes IT's asked, just give them the same permissions as the last guy. So it becomes absolutely vital that you understand what data each of your users have to your data set. Because otherwise, when anyone types in a prompt into Copilot, it could well return as part of that data set data that you would otherwise really not want them to have access to. And it could be any type of data, privacy information, you know, personal information, that HR data, if those individuals have access to those folders. Obviously, security is also a critical area. Again, Microsoft has considered that, and the servers generally are within the EU. Copyright, Tom touched on this. Microsoft has something called the copyright commitment, and that is them stating that anything created is owned by you. But there are exceptions to that. Obviously, if Copilot, if you've got a copyrighted piece of a PDF or something, or a Word document sat on SharePoint, and Copilot looks at that and uses that in the results, then Microsoft's copyright commitment does not cover that. So the consequences of getting this wrong can be quite severe. So just to look at some of the reputational issues.
Thanks, Gavin. Yes, and hopefully one of the themes throughout this session has been around security and mitigating risks. And some of the examples here we thought might help drill down a bit further. So there's a stat at the top there which says that 77% of businesses reported security breaches within AI systems in the last year. And that's from the AI Threat Landscape Report. As with any new technology that's introduced into a business, there are always security risks. And when things go wrong, there is the potential for harm to reputation, brands, and credibility. And some of these examples are probably worth mentioning as well. So one here was in the publishing world, where Sports Illustrated was accused of using AI-generated writers. So that was potentially harming credibility there. And I thought this aviation one was interesting. So in February this year, Air Canada was ordered to pay damages to a passenger after its virtual assistant gave him incorrect information. And I think Gavin's already touched on the risk of hallucinations. So yes, you know, generative AI is a very useful tool, but it's not foolproof. And it seems like this is one of the instances when things have gone wrong. And another one here, which is a a timely warning to the lawyers that are present, but it was a US case where lawyers submitted a brief to New York courts which contained fake extracts and case citations. And it later transpired that the brief was researched using ChatGPT. So we won't be out of a job just yet, which is good news. So yeah, I think reputational issues, brand protection, credibility, these are all issues which need to be considered. And you need to have that governance and clear strategy in place so that these risks can be mitigated. So where does it leave us?
And I think there's two strong themes here. What are the next steps from a technical perspective, and what are the next steps from a legal perspective? So just looking at from a technical perspective, obviously this is a big and complicated area. So this is really very high level. Clearly, there's a lot more that's needed. But a business case is an important first step. I mean, AI might not be right for everyone. I mean, the temptation is everyone wants to jump on the bandwagon, but it's really vital that you think it through, because it does a lot of things, but it's better to get it to do a few things really well than sort of throwing a lot of different things at a business and waiting to see which one works the best. So designing a use case for AI is important, which possibly involves, talking to a lot of departments, finding out if they're already using an AI, potentially in a more sort of subtle way, to really define what that you think that use case might be. If you're looking at something like Copilot, then obviously Microsoft 365, maturity assessment. So have you got the right permission structures? Because the second you turn it on, that data, if you don't want someone to look at it, is going to be accessible by everyone, or everyone with the permissions to view it. So make sure you've got your permissions right. Data hygiene assessment. And what that really means is, when we're saving Word documents and PowerPoint documents, is there enough metadata associated with those documents to be usable by AI? So for instance, does it have a meaningful title? Is the file name meaningful? Because otherwise, what it's going to do is potentially look at documents that were, say, 20 years ago and present them as current thinking. So you probably want to make sure that anything old is either tagged as older data, or you want to start archiving your data somewhere else. Obviously, making sure you've got the right security policies, because assessing this now is useful, but going forward, what are the rules that you're going to stick to ensure that AI sort of doesn't get out of hand going forward? Clearly, a gap analysis from where you are now to where you need to go to is important, and that will then filter down into some sort of plan. So you can prioritize what activities you're going to do. And then obviously the leadership team can be shown over the next 12, 24 months, this is what we're doing as we build up to AI. Now, so AI isn't a sort of a quick thing to deploy properly. There are certainly some important steps you want to go through, but it's vital, if your leadership team is saying, we should be doing something about AI, that you show them what that plan is, so they understand all of the activities that are vital to happen beforehand, so that the organization can leverage AI in the safest way possible. Obviously, the legal legal next steps is another area that's important to look at as well.
Absolutely. So from our perspective, it's really all about good governance and compliance to mitigate those risks and ensure that AI is being used in a fair and lawful manner. So similarly, it's good to understand what is being used within an organization. So the first step is usually an audit. So it would be an audit of usage. Understand the AI tools that are being used, how have they been trained, identify risks. There are several risks which Tom has already touched on. And then you're into the stage of formulating a strategy. So you would ideally end up with a list of approved AI tools, which are appropriate to your business operations and a lower risk. And then you would set about defining what the approved usage is of those tools. And then you would monitor that usage going forward to ensure ongoing compliance. Risk assessments is key. As we've already covered, great benefits are available here, but it does open up the possibility of further risk. So risk assessments are key to understand that risk and minimize it as far as possible. And regulatory compliance is an ongoing journey. We've obviously touched on key areas such as data protection, the new EU AI Act, which is coming in, and there will be other sector-specific areas which you will need to focus on. And I mentioned insurance here because I think whenever there's risk in a business, people naturally look to insurance. And I was reading an article yesterday which said that as yet, there aren't really any AI-specific insurance products out there. And the market sees this going potentially the same way as cyber insurance. So I think currently businesses would look at their current insurance and see if any AI risks are covered by the current terms. And I think it seems likely that you will start to see AI exclusions from current policies, which would potentially leave a gap in the market. So we may well see new AI-specific insurance products come into the market. So that's another thing to think about and keep an eye on as we're looking to mitigate risk. And of course, the contractual terms are always key. Tom's touched on the key aspects of negotiated contracts in terms of bespoke AI projects. But we would also always need to consider standard terms and conditions for off-the-shelf products because they will explain, how the system can be used and any restrictions around that. So it's always important to know the contractual rights, remedies, and responsibilities before you introduce any new systems into your business. And in terms of documenting this for the organization to understand as a whole, we would always recommend an AI policy. So that's something which would have board level buy-in. It would then be rolled out to everybody, and it would crystallize everybody's approach to AI within the organization, and it would contain those real roles and responsibilities. So hopefully we've covered some interesting aspects here. I think as with all technology, if you have the right infrastructure and governance in place, then you would be able to enjoy the benefits of it and at the same time mitigate those risks. Looking at the time, I think we've got a bit of time for Q&A.
I think there are some questions there, Ollie.
Okay.
The questions, I think that there's two similar questions just about how copyright, I think one is using copyrighted material for AI training a breach of copyright? And could the end user of AI be sued for copyright infringement if copyrighted data is used for training? I mean, I can sort of answer a bit of that, and then you guys take the legal side of it. Obviously, ideally, you don't want AI to be scanning copyrighted material because it will use that material as part of its answers, and then you are in breach of copyright. Now, with Copilot, there's something called data loss prevention now, or DLP. It's not a great name, actually, but what it means is ultimately you can tag your data with additional meta information. And Copilot, as of 2 months ago, will honor that. Now, by default, DLP enforcement, which is what it's referred to, is turned off. So it means whatever rules you put around your data, Copilot will ignore those. So if it finds copyright information, it will reuse copyrighted information in its replies if it's relevant. But if you enable DLP enforcement, it means your organization, as long as it correctly tags your copyrighted material, you can create rules where that material is not then used in responding to users' prompts. So where I was talking about part of the assessment and looking at your data, this is another aspect that you probably want to look at if you have a lot of copyrighted material that might be spread over various users' OneDrives and SharePoints.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah. Thanks, Gavin. So the two questions, I think, the first one relates to essentially who would be liable. Would a user be liable for copyright infringement if it was used to train the system? So the likelihood would be no. It would be the developer of that tool. If they had breached a third party's IP rights with respect to copyright, then it would be the developer that would likely be liable for any such claims. But yes, it is a breach of copyright law to use copyright protected works without license or consent in training systems. It's as plain as that. And what we've seen is that actually developers are somewhat ignoring this when training systems and are scraping huge amounts of data even from behind paywall protected journals and academic publications. So this is a huge issue for publishers. Something that I've seen recently that's quite interesting is the OpenAI and the Associated Press recently did a deal between themselves because the copyright point is kind of up in the air. So it looks like some businesses are taking upon themselves to deal with the problem. So that contract, the subject matter of that contract was granting access to OpenAI, granting access to the Associated Press's library and database of texts for use in training OpenAI systems in exchange for OpenAI assisting the Associated Press with various AI solutions and AI products. So that is a way of businesses deriving some value because they know that their content's being scraped illegally. So yes, it is a breach of copyright. Hopefully something will be done about this either through guidance or legislation in the future, and it'll become more settled. But I think businesses are already looking at ways to tackle this problem themselves.
Absolutely. And Gavin, just if we don't have any more questions, I was just going to ask you what sort of work are you getting involved in this area? What sort of queries are you getting from your clients in terms of AI projects? Is it incorporating Copilot to their existing operations? Is that the main focus?
Yeah, we're predominantly helping customers with Microsoft. So it's ensuring the approach that an organization takes into that whole Copilot world is a sensible, well-structured one. Our clients have all these sorts of questions that they're concerned about. It's a massive area. People are worried about being left behind because this is not a quick fix. They don't want their competitors to be operating more efficiently than they are, potentially at a lower cost base. So they want to get into the AI world, but equally, as we've discussed, where there's lots of benefits, there's lots of pitfalls potentially. So it's in helping them make sure they can avoid those pitfalls and quickly get the value from AI systems.
Absolutely. And Tom, you're part of our AI working group, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I think AI has real application in the legal industry. But as we've touched on throughout this presentation, it does come with risks. So I'm part of the firm's AI working group, and we're looking at tools in the same way that we've just been explaining throughout this presentation, in a kind of assessment of value, assessment of accuracy of outputs. We have our own generative AI policy, which is something we've recommended as part of this talk. So yeah, it's something that we recognize will be transformational and we'll need to implement, but cautiously and in a measured fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, I don't think we've got any more questions. So, here we go.
Process.
Should I read this one out? And well, whilst you're thinking about it. So thanks for this question. It says, you described Gen AI as essentially a predictive process. What is then the status of an organization-wide decision made by AI? Is it a more sophisticated prediction or something fundamentally different? How should we respond to such a decision? Director liability questions here too.
I think that's a good question.
Complicated
I guess the starting point from my perspective would be that an output generally isn't the finished article. So tools are used to guide and advise, but ultimately that's a starting point. So this is part of our generative AI policy, that it's used to inform a decision, but ultimately that should be sense checked and researched. So I would imagine that such decisions wouldn't just be made by the AI tool itself. They would form part of an overarching decision-making process, and therefore ultimately liability would likely still lie with the director rather than any tool.
I mean, it has the scope to make far more sophisticated predictions because it can absorb a volume of data that we would otherwise struggle in. But as Tom said, managing the scope of that decision-making process, I think, is important. I mean, it is likely over time that businesses will put in place controls, but as if they find that consistently the controls show that the prediction was accurate, it's likely that they will lessen those controls, which is probably going to lead to problems, because if you've got an individual that has to check the output, the 100th time they check it and it's absolutely fine, are they going to put the same level of effort in forever to check the output of these things? And this is really why businesses need to think now about how these things are going to be managed, because as an AI gets more scope of the influence of the output, even if it gets it wrong once in 1,000 times, the consequences could be quite significant. So, it's good to ask these sort of slightly more abstract questions because they influence our roadmap and making sure that hopefully these problems don't impact people.
Absolutely. And one of the areas which we haven't gone into detail on is the risk of bias and discrimination in the decision-making process. So, and I think it's probably telling that the list of prompts that you put up, Gavin, were mainly to facilitate these board level discussions. So, it's almost like we have a decision to make. Can you help us come up with an agenda? Can you help us formulate it? So I think, yes, as we say, having those processes in place, but it would ultimately be, a company decision rather than which was assisted by Gen AI rather than a Gen AI decision itself, which would bind the company.
Yeah, and I think one other point there is that Copilot is a very broad tool. It has application across various industries and sectors. But if your industry requires more nuanced responses, so for example, the tools that we're looking at as a firm are developed by specialist legal tech providers. So those pieces of Gen AI have been trained on wealths of legal practice notes, legal documentation, court judgments, so that the outputs are much more tailored to the needs of a law firm. So you could have that in almost any sector. If you focus the tool's mind in a specific sector, you'll get more sophisticated responses.
Absolutely. Well, as expected, we've used up the full hour. So all that remains is for me to say thank you to Tom and thank you to Gavin in particular from WaveX. And thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. We hope you found it useful, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on the next webinar that we host. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks all.